Okay, it should be broadcasting now. Hello, everyone. This is Tushar. Thank you for joining in. Just give it a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Hello, everyone. My name's Tushar Tejuja, founder and CEO at HackerTrail. Thank you so much for joining in for this webinar. I wanted to give a couple of minutes, and I think I've done that. So let's get started. So this we're going to do a series of webinars. First of all, hope everyone's doing well in the situation. COVID's been rather stressful for a lot of us for many different reasons, not just in Singapore but from around. And I think we've got some people joining in from different parts of Southeast Asia, at least as well. A couple of them from India as well, as we can see from here. So COVID's been hard, and what we see is there's lots of bad news floating around, which is kind of expected when you see a crisis running, but the extent has been unprecedented, and we see a lot of impact to various people who've had steady jobs and then are suddenly now at the brink of losing their job or have already lost that. And obviously, what we want to do was try and give back to the community as much as possible. So we're going to run a series of webinars. This is the first one that we're doing, which is focused on building a good resume that you can put in front of the right people. And subsequent talks will also talk about, how you represent yourself different from the others. How do you actually go through an interview? How do you prep for an interview, and so on and so forth. So starting with this one, introducing myself a little bit. Um, so I started my career way back in '98. Shows my age, 20 plus years of experience. And I started as an entrepreneur. I always had this that I want to start my own business. So I started then 2008. From there, ran that for a few years and then relocated to the US in 2001. Spent about a decade there building my career on Wall Street. Was an interesting journey. I lost my job as well in 2008 as part of the GFC, the global financial crisis that happened. I was part of Lehman Brothers at the time. And subsequently, 2010, I found myself in a great opportunity in Singapore, so I took that on. And I remember when I came over here, I had never been here, so it was quite exciting. But 10 years later, now Singapore is home for me, and I am a permanent resident here. I've built and grown my business here and plan to stay here for the foreseeable future. I've always spent my career in tech, built my career in tech, hired north of maybe 200-300 people in technology, different parts of the world, managed large global teams. My remit when I was at Barclays, I remember, was I think about 400 different applications that I had to support. So all through this journey, what really led me to HackerTrail, which is the company I run right now, is because I found tech recruitment in its fundamental state to be very raw, to be very fragmented, and to be in need of disruption. So I founded a company in 2014, and I've been running it since. And HackerTrail is essentially focused on trying to get the right types of talent in front of the right types of opportunities. And obviously, as we go through that, we see a lot of different situations where people are either gainfully employed and want to make a transition, or people are just fresh out of college, or people are very senior and now are having a hard time actually pivoting out of their industry. So I wanted to share some wisdom, some advice that we've gathered. So when you talk about our overall agenda for today, we're going to talk about a few key things. One is around why are we still talking about resumes in 2020? Really shouldn't be the case, but it is very much a part. The typical interview process that we see at companies, I should focus more on tech companies here. Who reviews your resume and what do they look for? So this is where it starts to get really interesting and exciting, and how people have different lenses and views on who you are and the perception of what they get from your resume. Then we'll dive deep into resumes, do's and don'ts. And then obviously we've dovetailed with a couple of areas in which we'd like to help you more one-on-one. So let's get into it. 2020, why exactly are we talking about resumes? So if you think about it, resumes are perhaps 40 or 50 years old. They've existed for the longest time. Our grandfathers have had one, obviously in its rudimentary state. And what we see is that some of the resumes still exist, and most companies, in fact, 95, 98% of the companies still talk about resumes being the version of truths that they recognize for candidates. And in my opinion, as I've built HackerTrail and I've been a hiring manager myself for a number of years, I find that tremendously disappointing, honestly, because that shouldn't be the case, right? 2020 should be about your skills, what you bring to the table. But the reality of it is that they need some way to actually gauge who you are. It has to be that first entry point, that first icebreaker, if you will, for them to understand who you are, what you bring to the table, and why exactly do you want them to take note of your resume. So I'm going to touch on some of those and how resumes over 20 years ago have now changed to what they are today, how they've gone from completely unstructured and completely scattered to how finding a definition and a theme and a pattern in your resumes is perhaps the most important thing in getting noticed. Um, the next subject is obviously around a typical interview process. So focusing a little bit of time here now. So interview processes vary greatly, right? I remember when I was interviewing for Goldman Sachs, even as a consultant back in 2003, it took me 7 interviews to get into Goldman Sachs. And that was the case because it was a rather fragmented process. I had to go through many different people. Sometimes, there'd be 3 people at the same exact level in the department, but they would want to interview me for an hour each separately and then collate their notes later on. And what I'm given to understand is that even 7 wasn't the highest number. There are people who are applying, I remember, for quant, in the quant trading department as front-end technologists, and they had to go through 15 or 17 different resumes. 15 or 17 different interviews. So if you think about it, that's really, really taxing, but it's also the reality of some companies and why their bar is so high. But generally speaking, when you look at an interview process, you'll see 5 steps, and these could really be crunched into 2 or could get extended to 7 or 8 steps depending on each company, right? So the first one starts with the phone screen, typically from someone from HR. And why that starts from HR is because HR is the first one who typically looks at your resume. Unless you're applying to a very small company like an early stage startup. And in that case, perhaps the founders would directly look at your resume and they would make an opinion or a judgment on whether they want to interview you or not. But that will almost always start with the phone screen because everyone has limited time and they don't want to invest more time and effort and in fact waste your time and energy for calling you down for the first round. Most of you who are experienced technologists already know this, but I thought I'll start with the fundamentals to set the ground. The second part is the technical round, and this one started to become really, really elaborate, right? So people go from whiteboarding to giving you case studies before to actually talking you through every minutest detail on what they see on the resume. This is typically conducted by someone who's going to be a peer or maybe one notch higher in the organization. And the goal is to really flesh out if you're worth actually taking through the next steps of the process. The HR part obviously is to do the phone screen. They may ask you a couple of tech questions, which is becoming more savvy in the HR space right now. So they don't completely waste the hiring manager's time. But this technical round really gets into the meat and guts of it. Now, in parallel, they could also offer you a technical test or they could do it subsequently. Regardless, but more often than not, if you're applying for a tech job, you will end up getting into a tech test. And this is typically between 2 to 5 hours long. Now, what this test essentially entails is either an automated test. So HackerTrail offers up automated tests to our employers as well. And some of them choose to use it. Some others have their own homegrown version of their tests. Other companies that we work with, typically product-based companies where the bar of hiring is really high, will sometimes even layer on 2 or 3 tests as part of the entire umbrella. So it can be quite consuming. And while this session is not to focus on how to crack that test, but that test is really again a make or break, right? This is where you will understand what is happening, how people are really viewing yourself and everything about who you are, right? The fourth part, if you crack the test and the technical round, you're more often than not pushed higher up to the head of department or the VP of the division or whoever it is, right? And this person could typically be controlling, 5 or 10 people in a small organization, or they could be even controlling 50 or 100 people in a larger organization. Regardless, what they're after is, yes, a little bit of tech, but not too much. What they're after is culture fit, which means how do you think about technology in the broader stroke, in a broader sense? How do you think about innovation? What do you actually do to keep yourself up to date? Those kind of questions. Will you actually be a good fit for your current team? And how do you visualize growth in your career, right? And then the last part, if you clear all of that, you will actually get into a negotiation with HR. And that's when you know you've really cracked it, you aced it, you're liking what you do, and I'm sorry, they're liking what you are, who you are, what you bring to the table, and obviously this is clearly a match. Um, like I told you, there are lots of interviews that entail, and an interesting fact is that an interview could take you up to 2 months to complete, right? So think about it. This is a marathon. It is not a sprint. If you are one who actually gets unnerved by a long interview process, calm your nerves. It could take you a long, long time. Each step of the interview could be drawn out between 1 or 2 weeks because logistics can be a nightmare to arrange, particularly when it's a larger company. When it's a smaller company, you've got that advantage of speed. People typically close interviews out within, sometimes I've seen the quickest I've seen is even one day, but typically 3 to 4 days, sometimes, 2 weeks, and then you're done, right? So each process is different. Now let's talk about who reviews your resume. The reason why we're starting from this angle and not dovetailing, not diving deep into the resumes is because you need to understand that you're designing the resume not so that you can feel good about it, it's so that it can make it through various hoops and jumps, right? That means you need to be very well aware of who's going to look at your resume and the angle that they're going to look at it from. And that's when you can design one which is exceptional and makes it through. So most of you may not realize, but your resume goes through an automated screening process, particularly if you're applying to a company of any size. Even companies of 100% plus who use an ATS, which is an applicant tracking system, will typically have some form of automated screening tools built in. Now, these tools are both dangerous as well as an opportunity. I'll cover them a little bit in further detail, but being aware of how they are and what they think like and what they pattern you like is very important. The second part or the second stakeholder to this is the company's tech recruiter. Now, this is the person who has been commissioned by the company to do one thing every day, which is look at resumes that are coming in, make sure they're talking to the best ones, and the judgment of best is left up to each tech recruiter, and then push it further through the hoops. Your resume will also be looked at HR managers. Sometimes HR and technology are HR and tech recruiters are two separate functions. And this is largely the case in MNCs. When you look at startups, tech and HR are mostly combined into one department. So they may have a similar view with which they look at a particular resume. Then it will be looked at for companies hiring managers. And obviously they've got a different lens, which again, we will cover during this presentation. Last but not the least, you must factor in agency recruiters. So some of you may be applying to jobs through agency consultants. These are consultants, and you may see, HackerTrail people reach out to you as well, if you're looking for an opportunity or if they find your resume to be fit. Now, these consultants, if they are trained, if they do their job well, they've got a very clear eye and they can recognize your resume. In fact, they are not so hard pressed to rule your resume out at some trivial stuff. They will really dig in deep and try and understand you as a profile, right? But if you come across some consultants who are not as good at their job or quite honestly lazy at their job, they will glance you over in 10 seconds. And if that 10 seconds fails to impress them, they will move on to the next resume. It's harsh, but that's the reality of it. So it's better that you're aware and you approach it with that lens. An interesting fact here, small companies, typically 2 to 4 people look at resumes. In MNCs, it could go up to 20 people. In one case, we've had 50 different people look at this niche resume that we were trying to float out before they actually decided to hire the person. Now that's a lot of eyeballs, right, on one resume. So you have to design this in a very comprehensive, at the same time, very straightforward manner. So let's talk about automated screening. Some of you may know this, some of you may not, but all systems that receive resumes right now are doing an automatic check on your resume. So if the machine has to do an automatic check for you techies out there, you will obviously know that your resume needs to be machine readable. Now, what exactly does that mean? Lots of people love including images as part of their resume. Unless it's a small profile pic of yourself, I highly discourage that. If you have to include a portfolio at the end. Maybe it's a hyperlink to your portfolio. That's an online website. All of that's fine. Go to GitHub, go start your repository there, load your profile over there, load your portfolio over there, make it online. Do that. If you want to go put one on LinkedIn, go do that. That's fine too. But in your resume, do not include images, right, as far as possible. Second thing is your resume must contain the right skills. Now, what that also means is, actually, you know what, I'm sorry, before I get to that, one part of the machine reading part. Do not put tables in your resume. Lots of resumes that we come across, I'd say roughly about 5 to 10%, people have various different old school table structures built into them, like the word formatted tables. Get rid of all of that. That makes it really tough for a resume to be read. Do not save your resume as a JPEG file because again, the machine will not be able to read words. Try and save it only as a Word document, much preferably as a PDF because Word has its own formatting and most machine parsers are trained to read a PDF, right? So that is very important. Otherwise you will lose at the get-go. In HackerTrail itself, we onboard and we read resumes through a machine. I can safely say at least 5% of them get trapped in this net where they've got non-readable resumes. That means the machine can't even start there. So automatically you've been disqualified without even being qualified. Again, it's sad, but if you think about it, that the machine's receiving hundreds and thousands of resumes, there has to be a way to crack into it, right? The next part is, let's say the machine's able to read your resume. So what does it read on it? So that's where it gets to the right skills. Now, what the right skills means that you don't stuff your resume with every single keyword out there, right? So us as techies, and I myself have been guilty of it when I was a young budding coder back in early 2000s. I used to put everything under the sun on my resume. Particularly if I'd work on a project, I'd find it almost mandatory to include every single technology that was used as part of that project on my resume, even though I may not have nothing to do with that technology. Or for example, I was never a SQL developer, but I used to have SQL always on my resume, and I never know why. Because someone asked me to write a query, yes, I'd be able to write a simple one, but I wouldn't be able to do anything more than that. So that's a false positive. So you put the right skills on it. And that's where you looking at the job description, studying it very clearly before you actually submit your resume for it is important to make sure that your right skills are there and it's appropriately put. The other thing that people typically do is, let's say if I've worked in Java on 10 different projects, I find it necessary to state that I've worked with Java on 10 different projects. Doesn't really make sense. If I can have a summary that lists that Java is one of my core expertise and what within Java, whether it's multi-threading, whether I've worked on particular frameworks like Hibernate or Spring, that's fine. I can list that on there, but I don't have to cut, copy, paste the same thing over 10 different projects and 10 or 20 years of experience. That's completely a false positive, right? So refrain to keeping your resume light on skills and put the right skills in there. The third part is, does your resume have the right keywords related to a project or an industry? Now, this one is super critical. Um, and what this means is that, let's say if you worked for the insurance industry. Now, let's say you've been a software developer for 10 years, right? And say you spent 5 years in the insurance industry and the other 5 years, you changed your domain completely, you went into telecom. So let's say you've got 10 years of experience, 5 in insurance, 5 in telecom. Now, you may have worked on similar-ish type of technologies, which is fine. But the insurance industry, the projects over there and how you build stuff is very differently on how you build stuff in the telco industry, right? So making sure that your industry context is within your resume is essential. Because the next industry, if you're applying for, whether it's telcos or insurance or a third one, people need to understand that you really appreciate your industry. You have a very clear understanding of your industry and you don't see your resume as one big mush, right? So putting the right keywords which are related to a project or an industry, very, very important. Next part, what is the percentage match of your resume when compared to the job description? Now, this is something that you can't actually glean, but this is something that the machine is looking for, right? And if it's a rudimentary machine, it'll look for a straightforward percentage match. If it's a more sophisticated machine, it'll benchmark you against the others and then find a pattern. And if you have the right pattern, then it'll select you for the next step. Regardless, this is automated, which means what you put, you don't get to say ifs and buts. You don't get to do anything. What you have put in there, even if you misspelled something, even if you put an extra hyphen when you were not supposed to, you are leaving it to the machine to interpret that. So creating a resume is not a 20 or a 30-minute job, which is why if you're looking for a job, start soon. Make sure that you're doing this over a period of time and make sure that you're taking care on all of the details in there before you actually call something as a final resume. The next part is, how does your resume rank against other applications? Like I told you, on an average, people receive between 100 to 500 resumes for a job. Now, 90% of these are irrelevant, but how do they actually achieve or arrive at what's relevant and what's irrelevant? The machine helps them get there. So again, keep your resume precise, keep all of the right data in it, and the machine will see it right through. One of the other things that people do quite commonly is that if you give a search for how do I actually get around machines and how do I actually trick the machine, what people end up doing is they end up putting a white space in the white space on the header or the footer of the resume. They'll end up coloring some font white and they'll start putting all kinds of skills that they've never worked on just so that the machine can pick it up. Please realize that that is a false positive. Machines are far more sophisticated. If they pick that up in the header or the footer, for example, our machine as well is trained on that. If it picks it up in the header or footer, it knows that you're trying to jack up your resume rating, and it'll create a negative mark against you, not a positive mark. So put only what you have done, what you can stand by, and make sure you include everything that you can stand by. Don't leave details out, right? The next part. So how does an IT recruiter review a resume? Now, this could be a recruiter who's working in-house, or a recruiter who's part of the HR team, or a recruiter who's working for the agency. First things first, they look for whether your resume is presentable or not. What does presentable mean? Does it actually look pleasing to the eye? Is it a 10-page document that they just don't want to read? Is it formatted nicely? Are there any grammar issues that you can see through there? Right? Particularly if it's a Word document or a PDF, now all of those issues get highlighted very easily. If any of those are seen on the get-go, you could be dropped without even standing a chance, right? Right there, because what they think about is, if you don't know how to represent yourself, how are you going to represent the company, right? So it has to be top notch. It does not matter if you're a fresh graduate or a senior person. Do not take your resume formatting lightly. Make sure that you've added in that extra flavor, and make sure you've given it to at least 4 or 5 people to look at so that they can give you their opinions on it. Again, no images unless it's a quick profile picture, and nothing which is in tabular format, which then gets netted into the system. Next part are all the keywords in your resume. So we spoke about keywords in the system before. This time around, what the average recruiter does is they'll start actually doing a manual keyword search on your resume, right? So let's say if you've got 50 different keywords listed on a particular JD, they know exactly which 5 keywords to look for because they've got 100 resumes to look through. So in that case, they will give a keyword search for those keywords on your resume to see which ones actually come through. Which is when, once they find the keyword, let's say if Java was one of the keywords, they find the keyword. That's not the only thing they look for. They look for the context in which you've written Java, which means if you've spoken about the particular project, if you've introduced how you use Java, how heavily you use Java, whether you consider yourself as an expert or a juvenile at Java, all of those are considerations for them, right? And so they will factor that in before they actually judge you. Remember, include only facts, because if they give a keyword search on your resume, and if they see that everything under the sun is included, again, I guarantee you almost it will be disqualified, right? Second thing is, when they are calling you, so following this, it'll lead to a phone screen possibly, right? So if they do call you, they would expect that you can justify everything that's listed on your resume. So be sure you're confident about everything that you put on there. The third part's around, just doing a quick time check for myself. Third part's around the type of projects and the companies that are on there. Now, this is really where the holy grail is, right? So let me take this as junior, mid, and senior people. Now, when you're fresh out of college, you obviously don't have a lot of work that you can talk about other than internship that you've done. If you're a really smart, savvy cookie, you've perhaps taken on some freelancing work, some real production-worthy work, which is fine. You list that on your resume. But if you're not, you've gone through a 4-year degree or a 3-year degree or perhaps a 3+5 or whatever. And as you've gone through that, you've amassed a lot of projects that you've done. Make sure you highlight your projects well. Not more than 2 bullets on each project, not more than 3 top projects on there. You don't want to cloud your resume, right? But in those projects, bring out what your role was. Don't focus on the V's, focus on the I's. There'll be plenty of time to talk about the V. So if your project was with 5 people, focus around what you did on that project, right? What you brought to the table. If yours was a pure leadership role in one and a coder in one and a data scientist in one, does not matter. Bring that out. It shows flavor, it shows versatility, right? If you can introduce a mock of what was done in the project and whether it went live and any accolades that you got for that, introduce that. If you've got 15, 20 courses that you've done, don't highlight those. If you're applying, for example, for a software developer role, highlight the courses on algorithms and data structures, right? Because that's most relevant to your job. If you're a dean student or if you're a scholar student or anything like that, or if you've gotten a scholarship, highlight those. It shows again what you've brought to the table. If you've got none of those, right? And let's say if you come from a tier 2 university, do not come from a tier 1 university, you're applying for a role, doesn't mean it's all doom and gloom. What that means is that you have to highlight what side projects you've done, how you've actually made your shelf shine, and why you think you are the best person for the job, right? If you're a mid-level professional, you get into this death trap where sometimes you believe you know a lot more than you do, right? If you worked on, let's say, AngularJS for a year, you think you're an expert at AngularJS. Nothing wrong with that. There's a degree of confidence that you should have, but you should also be realistic. You should know what you're a true expert at and make sure that that comes through in the resume. If there's area that you're opportunistically learning, talk about that. If there are pet projects that you do off to the side, definitely talk about that because people want to know how you think outside the box. Another thing to talk about is mentors. If you learn from people in the World Wide Web, if you pick up stuff, if you learn from Stack Overflow or wherever else, mention that. If you've got a GitHub repository, be proud about it. In Singapore, you'll be surprised to learn there's only a few thousand people who have GitHub repositories, right? So if you're one of those, certainly do that. If you're not, go sign oneself up. Go sign yourself up for one, not because it's the done deal. It's because you want to start contributing and learning from others, right? So highlight each project very carefully. Each company that you've worked on has to have the right level of detail in it. If the company is not a known company, spend no more than 5 to 7 words, maybe 10 words introducing that company. Do not write a paragraph on each company, right? This resume is about you. It's not about the company. If your role was clear at the company, call that role out, whatever that role was. If you've got a functional title and a corporate title, let's say for banks particularly, sometimes you're the vice president of technology. What does that mean? You've got 10,000 vice presidents of technology in a Barclays or a Goldman Sachs. So focus on what your role was and functionally put that on your resume. If you're a senior person, then it starts to get a little bit more tricky. Why? Because it's not just what you've done, but it's also the overall commercial acumen that you have that you bring to the table. How well do you understand the businesses that you've been part of? What have your contributions been to the business? So if you've built a team of maybe 5 people or 50 people, that's a very good highlight. But what everyone fears about senior people is that you're completely hands off. So if you are, be graceful about it. State the fact that you're hands off. Don't state 20 different technologies that if someone picks up the phone and asks you a question, they already know that you can't do any of that. Make sure that you're fact based. If you are more hands off, try and get yourself acclimatized with the technologies before applying for a role. Otherwise, you will do yourself a disfavor and feel like, why didn't anyone get in touch with you even though you've got so much of relevant experience, right? So your resume has to be very, very clear on that. The commercial acumen, as I mentioned, if you've helped the company bring in revenue or save the company expenses, talk about that very clearly. It has to be fact and numbers based, right? If you've instilled best practices, and this is even for mid-level professionals, if you've instilled best practices in your team, make sure that those are stated loud and clear in your resume, because everyone wants to know how you make your current organization better. Not just you sank in there, you did what you needed to, and then you left a couple of years later, right? The next part is your resume worth a 10-minute phone screen? So this is what it really boils down to, right? If they've looked at a resume, they've studied in great detail, they've looked at the keywords, they've done the project and company searches, they've qualified your resume, do they want to spend 10 to 20 minutes of their time getting on a phone with you? Because that means perhaps 2 to 3 phone calls to you. You may or may not be available. You may ask to reschedule. They may have about 20 people that they have to get in front of, so you may actually get buried to the bottom. There are X number of factors. That means your full package will make sure that they keep you top of mind and make sure that they get that phone screen done, right? Again, this is not the subject of this resume, but what that also flows through is that if you've done a good job on your resume and you're getting a phone screen, congratulations, but don't rest on your laurels. It's the start of the journey, not the end of it, which means you must have a 1 to 2 minute long, crystal clear pitch of yourself ready, right? Why do I say 1 to 2 minutes, even though this is a 10-minute phone screen? Is because this is how you will introduce yourself, right? This is how you will build that excitement and you will get them to say, yep, I made the right call by calling this person. And now I'm going to get into the details, right? So make sure 1 to 2 minutes of a crystal clear pitch is ready. So one important fact for you to know, there are lots of times that your resume may get interviewed by a non-IT person, right? Or it may even be by the personal assistant of an MD sitting somewhere. Now, as pathetic as this is the reality of it. This does happen all the time, which means what you put on your resume, the presentation of it, The user experience of it is what's going to catch the eye. So again, take the time, write a meaningful resume. With that, I'll jump into do's and don'ts. Um, so I'm going to go through three different resumes here and tell you about what I liked and what I didn't like, right? Mostly what I liked because I think I want to focus on the positives. So a lot of us here have old formatted resumes. What that means is you wrote your resume maybe when you started your career, maybe you updated it once and then you forgot about it. And what you're thinking in your head is that the next time I'm looking for a job, sure, I'll pick up my old resume and I'll start formatting it. And I'll improvise whatever I can. I'll put in some more keywords, more few keywords. I'll tidy it up a little bit, and off it goes. That is the wrong approach, right? Resumes have evolved significantly over the past years. So if you're not looking at an updated resume every year, doesn't mean you have to overhaul your resume, but you have to update it. Use the latest technologies, use the latest font types. Don't look archaic, right? If you use tables before, get rid of tables. If you're using images before, get rid of images. If you had your resume running into 10 pages, don't do that anymore, right? It's not going to fly. So there's a million tips that you can get out there. So I'm going to summarize 5 or 10 of them that I particularly like. So one is updating your resumes on a yearly basis. Make sure you do that just as if it's your New Year's resolution, right? Regardless of whether you're looking for a role or not. The same thing applies to your LinkedIn profile. Uh, Second part is unless you're a fresh grad, don't put your skills at the top, your education and skills at the top, right? So this is a mistake that a lot of people make, particularly when they're stuck to the same resume that they had 5 years ago. They think it's okay to actually list their degrees up front and then start talking about what they've done. Nope. Once you've got a few years of experience, your work experience takes precedence. In fact, from the time you start working, put your work experience up top, right? And then talk about your skills and your education and so on and so forth. The third part is have a meaningful summary. Now, whether you're a fresh graduate, mid-level or senior, this applies to all. Have a very meaningful summary and try and keep it to 50 words. Why I say 50 words is because, again, it needs to be punchy. And one thing I learned when I was at KPMG, and this was quite an interesting exercise they made us do, is we used to do a lot of client communications. And as part of that, they used to ask us to write an email to a client and then ask us to cut that by half. And then when we had done that, guess what they do? They'd ask us to cut it by half one more time, right? And why they asked us to do that is because every time you look at in this case, your summary, you will find things that you can trim off. So look at it like a hawk. Every word should count. Every word should be precise. No fluff, no nonsense. Focus on impact, right? Very important. 50 words, enough for a good resume, good summary. Last part over here is limit your resume length to 3 pages. Now, techies are infamous for this, particularly if you're working in a contract job and if you've done 8 contracts, you want the world to know in 1 page each per contract on what you've done and why it is so great. No one cares. Hard fact of life, no one cares. If your resume is more than 3 pages, it's going to go to waste. In fact, people already are hesitant to print resumes. And if you ask me to scroll, if I'm the hiring manager, if you ask me to scroll through an 8 page resume or a 10 page resume, I'm not going to bother. What I'm going to think like is this person cannot crystallize their own thoughts into a couple of pages. How are they going to do, whatever I need them to do? Every time I ask them to write a memo, that's what it's going to look like, right? So keep it to 3 pages. I'd say if you can get it down to 1.5 or 2, even better, but do not compromise the content. Your content should be in there, right? Remove redundant content. If you're talking about skills, etc., in each part of this thing, remove that. 3 bullets should be able to summarize what you're doing at each company, right? Don't use a 15 or a 16 type font size. Use a 10 or 11 or 12 type font size. Do not use a 7 or 8. Don't use fonts with serifs as far as possible, right? So for a Times New Roman font, for example, that's a serif font. Use a non-serif font. It's much cleaner, much lighter on the eye. Microsoft Word offers you something called a Calibri font. Very straightforward, very clear, very easy on the eyes. Use that for all of your resume, right? Another resume and what I like about it. So this one, when I look at this resume, and you would be thinking to yourself as well, if you would look at this resume, instantly it catches your eye. Why? Because it's not too heavy on the eyes. It's very well structured. I can see everything from work experience called out clearly to skills, to languages in this case, because this lady has a lot of different language varieties, to a nice summary up top, right? Now, in this, the photo part of it, like I said, is optional. If you'd like to add that, That's good. Otherwise, it's not mandatory at all. I think on as a statistic overall, uh, um, photos do create bias. So I think overall, I'd say we probably see less than 5% resumes with a photo, right? So if you're not comfortable, don't add that in. A crystal clear summary is very, very important. In this page, the one thing that I could actually criticize is because the summary has got a background behind it, this becomes very tough on the eye if it's printed, right? You can imagine if it's a dark color there and if it gets printed, I may not be able to read it clearly. So as far as possible, do not keep blocks as are shown over there. But the crystal clear summary is certainly what you want to do. One more thing here. If you've done 5 different things over the span of a 10-year career, right? Could be that you started as, I don't know, a system admin, right? And then you evolved to a data scientist over time. Let's just call it that. Good for you. Or maybe someone who started as a quality assurance person and now is a product manager. Great for you. But summarize very clearly what is the role you're after. So in this case, as Jane mentions right up front, she is a digital marketing manager. So if you're a data scientist, call yourself a data scientist. If you're, a product manager, call yourself that. Do not call yourself a jack of all trades. That's not the position that is being hired for. It's a specific position. You should be specific. In this case, what I particularly like is that left panel, right? So in the left panel, you see a clear, concise way on how someone can get in touch with you. Tells you about locations, tells you about Twitter profiles, tells you about a GitHub, tells you about a Stack Overflow, tells you about a LinkedIn and a mobile number and an email. All of those very clear messages. So if I'm a recruiter who wants to get in touch with you, I don't have to scramble and find your details. It's not somewhere embedded in the footer, which some people think is cool. No, it's not. Put it right up front so people can find it very easily. On the left panel, because it's there, it's all of the essential information. So she's chosen to put all her skills over there, all her languages over there. In this case, if you wanted to put, instead of languages, you want to put other essential information, let's say your interests, your hobbies, whether you've done a specific project, if you're, I don't know, maybe if you're a state level swimmer, whatever else that shows that you know how to stand out from the crowd, put that on the left, right? And on the right side, obviously, is all of the experience that you have. Very clear work experience is front and center, so they can get to it very, very quickly, followed by educations, followed by certificates and organizations, right? Feel free to change that as much as you'd like, but try and make sure that this level of data is covered. Should not be overcrowded, very light, very easy on the other eye. As I'm sure all of you on the call will agree, you would like to read this resume if you received something like that. Similarly, this one, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to do a quick check because I'm receiving lots of messages. Yeah. Guys, we'll get into Q&A right at the end. So resumes, do's and don'ts against the third part here, which is this type of resume. So what I like about this again is that clear demarcated section to introduce yourself before the interviewer gets into the details. So if you see that section up top, that section alone is enough to tell me who this person is, the type of role that they're after, what their crystal clear summary is, and where their contact details are. Right up front, I've made a mark as a candidate because I have already shown you that I can be concise, I can be precise, and I have given you the necessary information up front. From there, I break into work experience and to skills on the right. Now, if you've got relevant work experience, don't waste time. Highlight everything that you can as quickly and as clearly as possible. Again, if you're a senior person, if you've done some commercial worthy stuff, made the company money, or built a state-of-the-art product, or launched a new revenue stream, whatever else that is, make sure that's part of your tech resume. If you're a product manager, if you've built a product from scratch, make sure that that's highlighted, obviously, that you've done it from scratch, not just the fact that you've been a product manager at the same company for 3 years. If you've worked at an early stage startup, do not see this as a disadvantage. It's a very big advantage because you have learned how to operate and be successful in chaos. Make sure you highlight that very clearly. You went from an unstructured, chaotic environment to hopefully your startup has grown a little bit and you're part of the journey. If you were a co-founder and you decided to fold your company and then started to apply for a job, that is very, very valuable. Do not undermine the importance of that experience. But again, as a co-founder, don't start talking about managing your business. You're applying for a tech job, focus on the tech parts of your journey so that that's most clear and highlighted to the person who's looking at it. One part is the third part there, which is set clarity on the skills that you're great at and which ones you're training on, right? I mentioned that before, I'll say that again. Your resume has to state that here are the top 3, 5, perhaps 7 skills that you're damn good at. If there are another 10 skills that you've been practicing or trying to hone, it's fine. It's okay to include some of those, but make sure you introduce that you're learning those skills, right? So it doesn't become a false positive. So the minute they pick up the phone, they ask you, hey, listen, Jim, what do you do in I don't know in Angular JS again? And you say, yeah, I did some academic projects. I'm starting to look at some GitHub repositories and learn from people. Click. That'll be the end of that phone screen because they're looking for Angular JS, right? In this resume, what I think on the right, this person has put the number of skills. This is way too many. I would limit it to the top 5 skills if you can limit it to that. And the rest of them, I would put them somewhere in your resume, but not necessarily in the top 5, because then that dilutes your brand too much. I've already mentioned this before, but for young talent, focus on the extracurricular activities that you've done loud and clear if you've not got enough experience. In this case, if you've got honors, awards, anything that you've done, highlight that. And with this, I'm going to stop. There are lots of questions that have come into this. So let me start with answering some questions. I'm going to leave this up here, but pardon me for 1 minute. Let me just switch my screen and get to the question section. Okay, great. My team's been adding in these questions. I'm not sure if you can see the list of questions, but let me start from the top. Is it good to have a picture on the CV? So as I confirmed earlier, a picture on the CV is not essential, right? What you would want to do is add the picture on there if you think it's relevant. If you're in a marketing position or a customer position, that's when you find more resumes with the CV on there. Do not find it to be mandatory at all. Are always 1 to 2 pages CVs recommended? Yes, again, as I said, 1 to 2 pages is great. Ideal is 2 to 3. Do not go beyond 3. How do I present a career gap on my CV? Okay, so this is an interesting one. So lots of people, maybe mothers who've taken a break, maybe people who decided to follow their spouses to Singapore because Singapore is a very transient country, and they didn't find a job for the first year, or they chose not to get into a job and now they want to do that. That is completely okay. But call a spade a spade. On your resume, you should call that sabbatical out and ask to also introduce why you took that sabbatical. So the person who's viewing that resume clearly understands it. My wife, for example, she's taken a few years out because she was a full-time mom and she wanted to be a mom. And she states that emphatically now that she's ready to go back to the workforce. Doesn't mean that she gets interviews as easily as everyone else. The harsh reality is it does pose softly against you, unfortunately. But your best bet is that crystal clear summary introducing who you are and what you've done to bring yourself back up to speed, right? So before getting in there and actually starting to float your resumes, first, if you've got a gap on your CV, first beef up your CV. It has to be stellar, right? 7, 8, 9 on 10, not less than that. Don't submit a 6 or a 7 or a 5 or a 6 to anyone. They will not even bother, right? But then the second part is your summary has to be stellar, has to highlight what you've done previously and also how you've kept yourself up to date, right? That is very important because people are not so hesitant to take you into a new role. But if you've completely taken a career gap and you've not done anything about it and you're expecting to train on the job, then that's where you may find people to be more reluctant, right? Should I include job stints of 2 to 3 months is the next question. The idea is absolutely yes. You should include job stints of 2 to 3 months because that's if you don't, then that's going to show as a gap on your resume. Now, if it was a contract, call it that it was a contract. If it was terminated because sometimes we run out of a probation period, sometimes the company lays you off because they're not doing so well, whatever else it is, call a spade, right? Write that on your resume. You don't have to say, if let's say for whatever reason, some of you may have been let go. It could be a he said, she said story. Maybe you just didn't like something and you walked away. It's okay. And on that, you would not get into the details of why you walked away from that short-term stint. But you must definitely mention what you did there and introduce a line saying, would love to discuss with you in person on why this was a short-term stint, right? So the person knows that there is a story, there is context. You don't want to put it on the resume because you're being sensitive. They will take it offline with you if they like your resume. If you're a contractor, obviously there's no shame. If it was a contract, it was a contract, right? The next one is, should we include current and expected salary in the resume? Absolutely not. Do not include your salaries on your resume. Leave that information for the HR or the hiring manager if they ask you that, right? If the company has not advertised what the role is looking to pay, and they call you for the first phone screen, it is okay for you to ask them that, if I may understand, what sort of a compensation structure. Don't ask for what is the pay. That's very upfront. Ask for what is the compensation structure that you would look for in this role. Is there a range? Would you look at it as fixed salary plus a commission structure? Do you have a bonus structure in this role? It's okay to ask the HR person that. If they say that, listen, it's not the right time, we'd love to get back to you, or someone else will call you back, politely accept that and end the conversation. They will get back to you if they like you. How do I explain if I was laid off? I think I mentioned that before. Pardon me 1 second again. Sorry, lots of questions coming in. Um yeah. Another one that just came in was, okay, you know what? I'll take it in order. Um, Himani, if you wouldn't mind just appending this document, since it's a long document, can you just append the questions that are coming in at the end of it, and I'll continue answering them. Yeah, thank you. Um, yeah, so going through this, sorry. Should I present my profile in an infographic style, or does the traditional CV resume, word CV resume still do? Like I mentioned before, do not include infographics on your resume. Some people thought it was very cool to make an infographic resume. I am completely opposed to it. In fact, anyone who I know and I work with, when they look at an infographic resume, they look at it all funny, because contrary to popular belief, it is tough to read. It does not capture the level of detail that we'd like, and not worth including it that way. Should my format of my CV be in PDF, Word, or JPEG? Definitely PDF or Word, never JPEG. Never anything which is a static image, never something that is not machine readable. Um, I left on bad terms with my last employer. Should I include this employment? Yes, absolutely. The employment is essential. Regardless of how you slice this needs to be there, right? So you can always put in a note over there that you'd be happy to discuss this separately, but you must include that employment, right? If you don't include it, it poses even more questions. In fact, it automatically assumes that there was something wrong on your end. Um, what is the best font? I think I touched on it before, which is just use a plain font like a Calibri, which is offered up, or an Arial. Do not use any thick fonts. Do not use bold or highlights when essential. Only when essential, use that. Do not use too many colors in your resume, because it does not show well, right? And do not use sans serif fonts. Should I include a career objective or summary, or both in my CV? As I've said always, include a summary. A career objective should be just your title. Do not make it separate from your CV. It should be, do not make it separate from your summary. Your summary and your career objective should be one, right? And in your summary, it's okay to introduce where you're headed in your career, but that's about it. Um, Hold on 1 second. If my experience is more, let's say, for example, more than 15 years, then should I include all of that or not? Great question, right? So if I've been working for 15 or 20 years, should I include all of that? I'd say the last 5 years is the best highlight of your resume. The other 5 or the other 10 or 20, whatever, you can start to reduce the amount of data that you put in it. Of course, if there was something exceptional that you did, then you must highlight that, and you must draw your attention to that. And you can, mark it in bold if you need to, because again, you're specifically trying to draw focus there. But otherwise, stick to highlighting most part of your last 5 years of your resume and what you've done there, because 5 years changes a lot in a human being, right? And that's what people want to know, who you are today, not who you were 20 years ago. Lots of people, in fact, even in Singapore, we see this now. There are lots of PMETs who are getting back to the workforce, are silver haired, so to speak, who are mid 40s, late 40s, who've been out of job for 2 or 3 years, not of their own choice. And that's okay, right? And at the end of the day, that happens all the time. If that does, make sure that you list what you had done in the past, but again, highlight the last 2 or 3 projects that you did, even if those may be more than 5 years ago. But those last 2 or 3 projects or stints that you worked on, or experience that you had, make sure you give enough justice to that. Should I include all my certifications as appendix? Yeah, this is a pretty good one. If you've taken a certification 10, 15 years ago, don't bother including that, because that's way too outdated. My rule of thumb is, if you've taken a certification in the past 3 years, definitely include it. If you've taken a really tough certification 5 years ago, sure, include that as well. But the past 3 years, feel free to include it. If your certification has expired, this is a critical one because I've seen people losing an opportunity based on this. If your certification is expired, call it as expired, right? Otherwise, it'll cause a problem. Yeah. Hold on one second. Should I put my resume, my education first or last? I've already discussed that. Put it at the end. Um, is the cover letter still a thing? Yes. I didn't cover enough about the cover letter, ironically speaking. But one of the things that we see is that people overemphasize the use of cover letter, and they feel that someone's going to basically read through the entire thing if it's a 1 or 2 page cover letter. Almost never happens. The only time a cover letter is read in detail is if it's a fresh graduate and you met someone face to face. After that, you met someone at a career fair, and after that you send them a cover letter mentioning that meeting and how it was engaging. That works. Or if someone was introduced to you through a referral, that works. But if you do want to add something to your resume to make it spice up and make it stand out from the crowd, learn from a lady who applied to Airbnb. This became quite a pretty good one, where what she did was she actually took the time to create an entire PowerPoint deck of 5 slides where she spoke about the problem that was part of what she would have to solve on the job and how she would solve it. And it was amazing the responses she received. It went up all the way, I think, to the CEO of Airbnb, where they appreciated what she had done and the fact that she took that initiative. Since then, you see there are lots of people who score very, very good jobs because they have taken that extra step to show that this is not one of 500 applications. I'm applying to only 5 jobs. We had that once with HackerTrail as well very recently. Someone applied to a marketing role and she actually sent me an entire deck of, I think it was 8 or 9 slides. I think 8 or 9 may be an overkill, but it showed her enthusiasm, right? On HackerTrail's marketing problem, how she would solve it, her willingness to basically give us as much advice as she can and obviously learn from us and fine tune it even without the prospect of getting a job, just genuinely excited by what we do, right? So that's all is very, very essential. And that helps you stand out from the crowd. The next one is, should I include my date of birth, NRIC, home address, home country, etc.? Now, the jury is out on personal details. People need to get in touch with you, but what they need is an email address and a phone number. They do not need your date of birth. They do not need your NRIC, certainly do not need your NRIC, and certainly don't need your full home address. What you can state is if you've got a home address in Singapore and if you're okay with it, because Singapore obviously more safe than ever, you can include your zip code, right? So people know which locality, which area you're in, etc., which building you live in, but you don't need to mention your unit number, your etc., etc. All of that can be given later on if it proceeds. But definitely have your phone number because they need to get in touch with you, a number that's working at all times. Don't throw in 2 or 3 numbers over there. I see that frequently in a resume. This is my WhatsApp number because I'm frequently traveling. Use this to call me. No. Put in one number that you want someone to get in touch with you on. Put in an email address. Put in obviously the location of the country that you're in and put in a zip code if you want to. If you're in a more bigger, wider area, not like a Singapore where zip code is everything, then obviously, let's say if you're in India or Malaysia, then definitely be more specific as to what part of the country you live in. But that's it. You don't have to give the details, right? More beyond that. I've got last 5 questions that I'll get into, and then I think we'll stop there. Coming into project management. Okay, so someone's coming into a project management background. How would you reflect your background in programming if you've only done it in school? So I'm going to assume here that you're a project manager. You aspire to become a project manager, and you come from a programming background, but you've not practiced programming yet. So that's an interesting one. If you're going into a project management role, or if you aspire to become one, obviously they will look at your project management expertise. But remember, do not undervalue programming regardless of what role you're getting into. Why? Because programming teaches you structured thinking. It is one of the key skills of modern age on how you process data and how structured you are in your approach. So don't undervalue that. State about the programming stuff that you've done. Obviously highlight what within project management has taken your interest, even if it's a certification that you've done, and I'm assuming they're fairly junior, state certification if you've done that. If you've not, if you've worked on personal project management projects, talk about that. Always highlight any budget related work that you've done because people want to know the scope of the project you've managed. If you've managed people, resources, if that project was critical enough, mention all of that. If you've done none of that, and if you're just starting off fresh and hoping to be a project manager, the tough answer is you will probably not get that job. You can possibly start as a project administrator or a project coordinator and work your way up to the next level. Next question is how to reflect programming skills gained through online courses. Interesting question. This is becoming more and more popular because lots of people are obviously making their resumes and their resumes could have been doing something else and now they've switched to programming. No shy, no shame. The fact that you're taking on courses, maybe you're in your 30s or 40s, some cases even 50s, the fact that you're taking your courses right now is a very big deal in itself, right? So definitely highlight those, definitely highlight the projects that you've done over there, but also genuinely speak about your love for programming, right? And what you do to keep up to date, not just based on that one course, right? Because that course says something, but it doesn't say everything. So if you've got your GitHub, if you've contributed, if you're actively learning from folks, if you've got questions that you're trying to answer in Stack Overflow, if you're quizzing or following people on Quora or Reddit, whatever else it is, make sure that that is reflected through your resume because that is your best chance of getting noticed, right? If you find, here's another thing that's appealed to me before. Someone applied to us for a front-end developer role, and they had a similar expertise where they did not really have too much, but they had gone through a general assembly course. So what they came back and did was they actually gave us the PPT, a PowerPoint deck, to highlight 10 different points that they thought we were doing wrong on hackertrail.com. And ultimately, that person did not get the job for various reasons because they had applied for a senior level role. But that person got a full-on interview. Why? Because they had shown that they cared enough. They took and they applied their skills to the product company that they were applying for a job for. Right? So it made it very contextualized, and that was very relevant. The next one is, can your LinkedIn have the same content as your resume? This comes from Mohammed. And I'm sorry, the previous questions actually came from a lady called Shiwe. Thank you for that. So Mohammed, thank you for that question. Can your LinkedIn have the same content as your resume? Absolutely. It can have the same content as your resume. In fact, it should be consistent, right? So if people see a different version on LinkedIn versus your resume, they start to question that. So don't worry about making your resume too light or loading up your LinkedIn profile too much. Do the same job in both. And if you see, LinkedIn has also learned over time what works and what doesn't work. So LinkedIn is a great way to create a structured resume. It allows you to put an introduction about yourself, who you are, what you bring to the table, allows you to put as many details as is required, right? So absolutely, yes. The next question is, I'm from a non-tech background, formerly government, and now in a tech support role. I'm looking to get into web development. Should I craft my resume differently since most of the relevant skills would more likely lie on my side projects? Yes, you should craft your resume differently. The fact that you're from a non-tech background, that's what you've earned your stripes in. So highlight what you learned from that non-tech background, right? 2 or 3 crystal clear bullets that dovetail into this job that you're applying for. If there is absolutely no correlation, those are completely poles apart, no problem. Make a reference to your non-tech background and introduce an element in your resume as a break to say switched careers into tech, right? It's okay to do that. People will recognize and they will be able to read your resume much clearer, right? And then now you're in a tech support role and you're looking to get into web development. Congratulations. Big step forward to actually jump your careers and get into more advanced levels and more tech savvy levels. But a tech support role is certainly relevant. You can highlight what sorts of tech support you did there. When it looks into getting to web development, you will have to either introduce if you've done short courses and how you've actually beefed yourself up. If you actually got to experience some part of web development as part of your tech support, please introduce that as well, right? And then obviously focus your last, I'd say your top 20-25% of your resume on why web development is the core of what you should be considered for, right? There is no harm, there is no shame in the fact that you're switching. But if you're out there and if you're switching just on a whim to say, hey, listen, I like web development, let me go do that, it's not going to fly, right? You need to introduce why people should look at your resume. So 3, 4, 5 crystal clear bullets on web dev. Last couple of questions. This is from Rohit. The resume which you had shown is good. Is it good to have such a resume as a fresher? Absolutely, Rohit. Why would you say not, right? So the resume that I've shown is all encompassing. Like I said, if a fresher means that if you've got less work experience and if you highlight most of your project work, go ahead and do that. But having a crystal clear resume is never an option. It's a mandate, particularly in this world where machines are reading your resume. You need so much of quality information on there. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the deck will go out later on. So in that deck, you'll also see links to where I got those resumes from, and you can go and quiz those sites. Uh, what could be your best? This is a strange one. What could be the best answer for your expected answer? Sorry, I didn't quite understand that. Okay, let me think about that a little bit while I go to the next one. This one's from a girl by the name of Preeti. Um how do we get our resumes through the ATS if our degree is not aligned? Uh, Hold on 1 second. I'm not able to see someone's typing. Uh, Even though I have relevant experience. Oh, got it, got it. Okay, cool. So the question is that, I'm sorry, guys. Sorry, 1 second. The question is, hey guys, for my team, if you can just stop typing for a second, it's overlapping a little bit. How do how do we get our resume through an ATS if it is not aligned with that what is asked in the JD, although we have relevant experience? Okay, so this person's question is, my resume does not have the right education, but my resume does have the right experience. Don't worry about that, because your resume is going to go through more than likely, right? The fact that you've got all of the right information about the type of role that you've applied for, I seriously doubted if your education itself is going to hold you back, right? Of course, that's one notch, but then if you've done enough of relevant stuff in your resume and if that's highlighted very clearly, trust me, it'll get shortlisted, right? Or it'll at least move through the ATS, the automated grading system. Um, there's another question from Shivi. You mentioned to put love of programming. Where in your resume would you put that? I would put that as part of your summary. Very, very clearly, I would put that as part of your summary, right? If you introduce that, that means what you're saying is that this is who I am, this is what I've done. So if you do that, then you would be doing yourself a big favor. You'd be introducing to the person, and this is particularly relevant for either innovation companies that you apply at or even startups, right? They love this kind of stuff. And so definitely highlight that. There's another one which says, can you share a good CV? I think this individual may have missed a little bit of what we did earlier. I think there's someone by the name of Maru who asked that. Yes, I can share you some good CVs. I think after this, I'll obviously send you the deck that's got 3 CVs in it. It's got a number of links in it as well. And then after that, I'll obviously make myself available. You can certainly connect with me on LinkedIn as well. And then, we can talk about some more good looking CVs there as well. The last question that I'll answer right now is, because I think we're a little bit way past time, is so that was the question that they asked. What could be the best answer for what is your expected salary? Yes, so this is the tricky one. So if someone has not actually told you what their salary expectations are, what their salary band is for the role, but they instead want to ask you, it typically shows that you're speaking to someone who's junior, right? Because they've not given you the professional courtesy of sharing first. They've asked you first. But nevertheless, it is a reality. It happens all the time. So great question. I think the way you should approach this is by stating, first of all, what your last drawn is, right? So don't start with your expected, start with your last drawn salary. Even if your last drawn was a year back and you've taken a career break, start with your last drawn salary, right? And after that, tell them that, listen, I'm not so much about the salary. I am more about the role. Make sure you state that if that's genuinely your interest, because if salary is what you're after, more than likely at some stage of the interview process, they will sense that very clearly and you will probably be off their books. So focus on your importance of the role and what you think is your contribution that you can bring to the role. And you are looking for market salaries. You are not looking for anything extraordinary. It's good to actually state that as well, right? So they know that you're realistic in your expectations. Um, it is also polite for you to ask at that point, can I please understand what is the compensation package for this role? It is perfectly legitimate for you to do that because they've already asked the question from you. And I think that ends the entire set of Q&A that we've had. So I think I'm going to stop here. If you can, you've obviously seen this thank you slide. You've been looking at it since the past 15 or 20 minutes. So thanks once again for taking the time to listen in. Hopefully you got something good out of it. And if you didn't, certainly feed that back to us and we'll try and get better. We know that COVID has hit us hard and we're trying to do what we can. So there are a lot of free career seminars that we're going to line up over the next several weeks. Feel free to join as many of them as you'd like. What we're also offering up is because we know some people are really hurting. And it's also because they've been in jobs before. They probably may not have a job now. They're looking to switch careers. It's hard, right? So we'd like to do our bit to help. We'll offer you, first 5 people who've already written in, maybe, I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the community box yet, but obviously you'll get free career coaching there. And then first 10 people will get a resume review. And obviously if you're looking for a tech job, please feel free to sign up on hackertrail.com and you'll get a lot of good jobs to go after there. So thank you very much for again taking the time and have a fantastic evening ahead and stay safe. Cheers. Bye-bye.